gas liabilities. My name is Mark Dorin, and I'm a member of this coalition through my company, Dorin Land and Oilfield Management. I have 40 years of worldwide oil and gas experience, and I'm also a longtime Alberta landowner whose life has been profoundly impacted by the crisis of aging oil and gas wells in Alberta. The cost of cleaning up aging pipelines, tailing ponds, and old wells that are no longer producing, as well as related facilities, licensed and unlicensed, has been growing for decades. The Alberta Energy Regulator has told us the cleanup will cost $58 billion. Today, we will show you that there is no way this can be true. Now, the government, and let's be clear, this means us, the public, are not legally responsible for cleaning up any mess left by industry. However, as an owner, manager of lands impacted with active and abandoned wells, as a representative of landowners, and as a member of the property rights community, I know the facts firsthand. The responsibility to pay for use of land and to reclaim these sites is often downloaded through landowners to the government, ultimately each taxpayer. The potential for this phenomenon to increase is significant, and it's real. We are here today to launch the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project. We are doing so because Albertans simply can't afford to wait another 4 years for variable solutions as the mess continues to grow. We are a coalition of researchers, academics, former regulators, impacted landowners, and problem solvers. We have differing ideas as how we might best address this crisis. We have identified a range of solutions. But the one thing we all agree on as coalition members is that the task of solving the problems we face cannot begin until the Alberta Energy Regulator and the provincial government come clean on the facts pertaining to the true financial extent of the problem. As a prominent legal scholar put it, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that is why we're calling on all party leaders running this provincial election to make a commitment to tell Albertans the truth. We ask these leaders to transparently disclose what the real cost shall be to clean up aging oil, gas, and mining infrastructure across the province. It's common sense that if you don't measure it right, you cannot manage it right. Today, for the first time in our province's history, we're releasing a new independent estimate of these costs. This estimate was prepared using the Alberta Energy Regulator's own methods and data, which were obtained through Freedom of Information requests. Our first speaker is Regan Boychuk. Regan is an independent public interest researcher studying Alberta's oil patch. In 2010, he published a peer-reviewed study of royalties and profits with the University of Alberta's Parkland Institute as research manager. Regan was appointed to the 2015 Royalty Review Panel's Oil Sands Expert Group. A leading expert on the challenge of Alberta's aging and expired oilfield infrastructure, he participated in the Liability Management Review. Regan was retained by the University of Calgary's Public Interest Law Clinic in support of their intervention on behalf of landowners at the Supreme Court in the Redwater Energy case. He has briefed Alberta Energy, Alberta Environment, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the Finance Minister, and the Auditor General's Office on the issues he will now brief all of you on today. Mr. Regan Boychuk.
Alberta has over 300,000 oil and gas wells dotting every corner of the province. They're in farm fields, in school playgrounds, and right in people's backyards. More than half of them are inactive and no longer producing anything. They sit idle and they may look harmless, but they are not. All wells leak eventually, and that's why it's so important that they are plugged and reclaimed properly. They leak methane and toxins into the air and water, hurting the health and safety of families and communities. They harm the livelihoods of farmers whose land these wells sit on, lowering their land values and threatening farmers' ability to obtain credit. They must be cleaned up. Today we're establishing a new floor under what that cleanup will cost. Publicly, Alberta's energy regulator says just the oil and gas well segment of this cleanup will cost $18.5 billion. However, internally, experts inside the regulator suggested this was significantly underestimating the future cleanup cost industry and the public could be liable for. We wanted to know how the regulator got to these numbers. So we put in freedom of information requests using the regulator's own data and methodology. We discovered the real cost between $40 and $70 billion. Let that sink in for a moment. $40 to $70 billion. That's 2 to 3.5 times higher than the $18.5 billion the regulator publicly reports to Albertans. Right now, only about $200 million is being held by the province as a deposit to pay for that eventual cleanup. That's as little as 0.3% of the cost to do the job. The question is, who's going to pay for the cleanup and by when? In Canada, companies are legally required to clean up the mess left from their operations when the wells are finished producing. And yet for years, landowners like Mark have been raising the alarm about old and non-producing wells littering the lands, not getting properly reclaimed, putting the health of their families and neighbors at risk. Fiscally, all these wells need to be cleaned up eventually. Fiscally and environmentally, this is a ticking time bomb. And if the past offers any indication of the future, we, the public, are at serious risk of being stuck with much of this $40 to $70 billion bill. I'd like to take a minute and tell you about how we arrived at these numbers. In its internal study last year, the Alberta Energy Regulator's subject matter experts did impressive work. They put a lot of effort into developing a framework for developing specific costs for specific types of wells. However, the regulator never finished their job. They didn't apply the appropriate cost to the appropriate wells. And because not all wells are created equal. Some are relatively simple and cheap to clean up. Others are more complex and expensive. And the regulator knew they hadn't completed their work, and they knew the public estimate of $18.5 billion was flawed. They started to do a more nuanced and credible calculation, but for some reason they stopped. We don't know why. So we went ahead and got their data and finished the work for them. With the regulator's own data, we were able to offer 3 detailed estimates for every well and well site across the province to arrive at our total of $40 to $70 billion in well cleanup. With this new data, we are raising the floor of the debate. The AER cannot claim cleanup will be any cheaper than $40 billion. Our results and methodology have been reviewed by academics who are experts in the accounting of oil and gas liabilities here in Canada and in the U.S. Greg Rogers is a contributing expert to the U.S. Government Accountability Office's report to Congress on environmental disclosures, and he literally wrote the book on accounting for environmental liabilities. Dr. Thomas Snyder is a member of the expert group on resource classification at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and a professor of accounting at Ryerson. And Dr. David Cooper is emeritus professor of accounting at the University of Alberta's School of Business. They are available by phone to take your questions. I hope you'll take the time to chat with them. As far as the data that goes behind these estimates, it's going to be readily available for anyone interested. We're also working with mapping consultants to translate these giant spreadsheets into maps and illustrations that will, in the coming weeks, be available online to dive into and help digest the well-specific data across the province. So what does all this mean? Today's research announcement is focused on the cost to clean up only oil and gas wells. But what about the rest of oil field cleanup? Aging pipelines, facilities, tailings ponds, and more. They all need to be reclaimed eventually. So if AER got it so wrong on their estimates for wells, we can only imagine how wrong they are about the full cost of reclaiming all of Alberta's oil field infrastructure. The regulator can't be trusted to be honest with Albertans about the true cost of cleaning up a century worth of oil, gas, and bitumen development. For the sake of our health, environment, and future government budgets, we need transparency. That's why today we're calling on all parties to commit, if elected, to release the true costs of cleanup. If we don't know the size of the problem, how can we begin to solve it? What I do know is we can't afford to wait 4 more years to fix this. Thanks.
Thank you, Regan. The video you're about to see is a snapshot of the story of what have happened to my family because of oil and gas operations next to our family home. The well site remains unreclaimed. Stories like this play out all across Alberta. They involve different people and communities, all of whom deserve to know that their health will no longer be put at risk by allowing inactive wells to remain on their land.
You know, one of the most, I get upset when I talk about my mom.
We didn't know what it was like to have your life controlled by an oil company. And we really didn't know what we were in for, that's for sure.
After a period of time, the well could no longer be produced, and there's 20 wells like this in the old Stidsbury area. So the oil company sold them for $1, and he took the pumping unit out and the rods in the well out, and he put in what's called the plunger lift. And this is a means of blowing the well directly to the tank, and that occurred bypassing the gas meter. So what happened was every 25 or 30 minutes, there was this large blast of a little bit of oil with a lot of gas that created these directional plumes of gas that would float across the land.
I have a big garden, and the oil well is not very far from my garden. I'm not prone to headaches, but that's the first thing I noticed was I'd go out in the garden and I would get not just an ordinary headache, but it was a splitting kind of a headache. I didn't really think about it because we were used to having that oil well there. It just didn't occur to me.
She noticed that she described it as a loud noise like and she said it looked like something like a bird flapping on the top of the tank.
It was like a little bird, you know, and it would click on like that, click on. And it finally dawned on me that I had a headache. That's when I would get the headache, but it was because I guess the wind wasn't from that direction every day, and that's why it didn't occur to me.
There's a thief hatch and it's weighted, and it's to keep gas in but to open so that the tank doesn't explode. And this was what was happening. This weighted thief hatch was chattering because there's vast volumes of gas coming out.
I now have been diagnosed with Parkinson's, but I know that I've had it a long time.
So that's why I'm doing this. Human lives depend on it. The AR is not listening. The elected officials of this province aren't listening. We need to reach out to the public. I live in urban Red Deer. I live in an old oil field area. All those abandoned wells leak. They're all leaking gas. We're literally being gassed in our homes in this province.
And my mother's here in the front row. If anyone wants to speak to her later, she made her film debut today. Our next speaker is Dwight Popowich. He's now retired after 45 years working in finance, building construction, the grain industry, municipal government. For the past 20 years, Dwight and his wife Sharon have developed and lived on a 75-acre parcel of recreational farmland, 5 minutes south of Two Hills, Alberta. He is active in his church, in his community, and more recently, property rights work. Dwight is here today to talk about the impact of an inactive gas well and related facilities on his land and on his life.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. In 2008, Perpetual Energy Operating Corporation informed us that they wanted to drill a natural gas well on our land. As Albertans, we know the importance of energy development to the province and felt that we needed to do our part. So we signed a surface lease, and for 8 years we had no problems with the well operator. They paid as per the contract and always on time. We were happy with the arrangement. However, in 2017, our annual lease payment didn't arrive as usual. Unknown to us, Perpetual, for the sum of $1, sold the well on our land along with 2,299 other low and non-producing wells to a newly incorporated junior energy company called Sequoia Resources Corporation. We hunted down Sequoia to get our annual payment, and as it turned out, the only payment. Sequoia Resources declared bankruptcy 6 months later. It was in the Alberta energy sector for a whole 18 months. We were perplexed with the AER's approval of Sequoia's business plan. The AER assures landowners that our annual lease payments will be protected, meaning that when a company doesn't or can't pay, the government will advance the money and go after the company themselves. On September 6th, 2018, we applied to the Surface Rights Board for a Section 36 lease payment recovery. The SRB website says the rent recovery application takes around 90 days to be completed. 6 months after applying, we still had no written response from the Surface Rights Board. I called to inquire the status of our application. I'm told that they're working on the 2016 applications. They're 3 years behind. We can't understand why. You know, the AER recently bragged to the Senate Standing Committee reviewing Bill C-69 about getting operator approvals in very short times. The AER's website estimates 5 business days to get a routine gas well approval. So why not do that for landowners and their rent recovery applications? In our eyes, the $2,500 annual lease payment is insignificant. It's the fact that we have a gas well on our land that hasn't produced since June of 2012 and is affecting how we may develop the rest of our property. We can't maximize value because the well's location creates problems with subdividing the property. We hear about lowered land values and property sales being affected because lenders are refusing to mortgage abandoned well properties. We know the well has no real value as it was sold for less than $1. So why is this worthless, non-producing well still on our land? I'm retired and waiting for my wife, who is a nurse of 35 years, to do the same. Our retirement plan has always been to sell our rural property and move into Edmonton. Now we worry about our retirement and financial future. That leaves us with a lot of questions. How many other Albertans are affected by our government's gross neglect in ensuring that funds needed to clean up sites like ours are saved?
Thank you, Dwight. The coalition invited all leaders of all political parties running in the election, the current provincial election, to this event. You'll all have the opportunity to speak one-on-one with additional experts and impacted landowners in the room, some of whom I will identify now before the speakers take question and answers. So we have Mr. David Swan in the room, a recently retired MLA and longtime advocate for the environment. Former public lands inspector Dean Wetzel is also here. Landowners Vern Breton and Niall Hawkwood are here. There are other landowners and a former regulator in the room, and I encourage you to speak to any of them about their real life experiences. There are also some academics and experts in the room or available by telephone. I'm not sure if Dr. Lucia Mukenbox is present. She is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary with focus on environmental, resource, and energy economics. Available by phone are Greg Rogers, who's an international expert on environmental accounting and disclosure, and Dr. Thomas Schneider, Associate Professor of Accounting at Ryerson University with a focus on social and environmental accounting. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today and for your interest in this critically important subject matter. We're going to now move to question and answers.
There's some documents from 2018 showing from the AER that say that reclaiming orphan wells could be costing up to $260 billion. So what's the discrepancy between all of these numbers?
Yeah, the regulator's internal study that references that $260 billion number was comprehensive for the energy sector. It included oil sands mining, in situ production, coal mines, as well as pipelines. And we filed Freedom of Information requests to better understand all of those elements. Most of our requests were refused. They released no information except on oil and gas wells. So that's the one component that we were able to dig into on solid footing to get a better understanding of, and that's what we're reporting today. This is a portion of that internal study.
So that estimate is slightly lower than what the AER had estimated with that 260 billion figure. It was 100 for wells, right? So could you explain, like you're talking to a sixth grader, how that difference is calculated?
Yeah, the way that they came up with that $100 billion number included a number of components. don't have the transparency to be able to dig into deeper. It include in situ production, steam-assisted gravity drainage, tens of thousands of wells that produce a couple million barrels a day. We don't have data on that, so that wasn't included. It also includes almost 100,000 facilities. That was part of their $100 billion number. We don't have the information to dig into that deeply. So it's a small proportion of that 100,000, and we're using the same numbers that informed that $100 billion number. We're just completing the work in greater detail to be able to offer more granular. It's all the same data that led to them reporting that number.
I have two questions. One is related to your financial figure 40 to 70. So which wells are we talking about? Are we talking about orphans, suspended, or what categories fit into that? And then secondly, what fix are you calling for? Like companies to put up bonds or some other type of money to take care of the environmental cleanup? Because we've seen obviously that the LMR program has been somewhat disastrous.
So first of all, the wells that we're focused on is there's slightly more than 300,000 wells in Alberta that are unreclaimed. And so every well, whether it's active or inactive, is going to have to be cleaned up eventually. And they all have a liability associated with them. And so this estimate is for every well that is yet to be cleaned up. This is about half of them are still producing. Only about a quarter of them produce anything of significance. So about 3/4 are effectively depleted beyond being able to fund their own cleanup. And so this includes all the wells, active or inactive. And as far as the solutions, the Alberta Liability Disclosure Project is a coalition that's focused on transparency. It's made up of a number of concerned groups who have different ideas about how to best reform, but what we all agree on is that the first step in all of that is having a firm grip on the problem and the transparency required to understand the problem before we can come up with solutions. And that's the problem working off of the public numbers. If we don't appreciate the scale of the problem, the proposed reforms are going to be inadequate. And so the first step is to get a better grip on the scale of the problem so the resulting problems match that.
Sure, but fundamentally, I mean, are you looking for more of a contribution from industry? Are you looking for a taxpayer solution? I mean, what's sort of the baseline for what you're looking for here?
Well, the industry is who's responsible for returning every one of these sites to near its original state. And that the urgency of this problem is ensuring that the industry does fund that cleanup. Because if we fail to hold the ones who profited from this development accountable for the cleanup, it will fall to the public. And that's the urgency related to this. If we fail to solve the problem, it will all eventually fall to the public.
Can you guys all agree that there should be timelines, though, for the amount of time that those wells can just sit there? Can you guys all agree on that?
Yeah, I think everyone who's ever looked at this issue, it's the most obvious common sense solution that there should be timelines. Other jurisdictions have timelines that have been effective. The very first time this issue became a public issue back in 1989, Alberta Energy put out a paper and proposed 3 solutions, and one of them was timelines. It's common sense, but 30 years later, we've yet to implement those timelines. It's common sense, but it's yet to be implemented.
So if one of the parties that's running right now doesn't have timelines as part of their platform, is that a glaring omission in your mind?
Yeah, that's the lowest hanging fruit and the simplest thing that we can agree on. It's important that those timelines mean actually reclaiming well sites and not something else. That's the most important part. But timelines are a gaping hole in everyone's proposals and the most common sense reform that we need to see.
Can I ask another? Yep. Why do you think this has failed to be an election? I mean, whenever we hear about energy in terms of the campaign, it's pipelines, it's some war against foreign funded environmental groups, et cetera. This seems to be an actual crisis that is in place right now that needs to be dealt with. It's sort of been hanging out there for years. Why do you think it really hasn't sort of taken off as a big election issue? Maybe I can ask you and also Mr. Kahn as well.
I,
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
I think there's a conflict between everyone wants to see the energy sector continue to flourish and develop, and cleanup conflicts with that. We can either spend money on drilling more wells or spend money on cleaning up, and that's the mandate of the regulator itself is conflicted, both to protect the public and to facilitate development, and it's a thorny dilemma, and for too long in Alberta, that conflict has been resolved by simply focusing on facilitating development. And that is what has allowed us to accumulate so much cleanup, because that conflict hasn't been balanced. And this problem is no secret. Regulators and the government have struggled to deal with this for decades. And it's continued to grow, and it's become such, the bigger it gets, the harder it is to tackle. And that's another incentive for hoping to keep it under the rug and postpone the day of reckoning until after the next election.
Is it your belief if you don't get commitments now, it'll be ignored once the next election's over?
Well, this is the moment when politicians are the most receptive. The day after the election is when politicians are the least receptive to public concern. And so that's why we are making this data public today in efforts to try to influence this debate and try to put this issue front and center on the agenda where it belongs.
I think it's a failure of leadership. Politicians should be looking out for the environment and our economy and our energy industry. And actually, I think it's not an either or. I think we should be supporting our homegrown energy companies who are responsible and responsibly developing our energy resources. And the bill's going to fall on them and taxpayers if companies aren't held to account. And that was apparent in the I think it was a Chinese-owned company that went into receivership, and all those orphan wells were dumped into the Orphan Wells Fund. So that fund is going to be funded by the energy companies that are profitable and are based in Canada and have to follow the Redwater decision. So it's really hurting our energy industry too to not properly regulate and fund this cleanup.
So just a question on who pays for these cleanups now? Can you just explain how the companies that are making money and operating now have to pay into a fund? And if that pool of companies continues to shrink, do they pay more, or is it just the load is much higher? Or how does that restrict possible development to bring in more money, that sort of thing? Like, it seems like it's just always going down and shrinking and there's no money.
So because there's so few requirements mandating the cleanup within any sort of timelines, companies are free to postpone this indefinitely. The cleanup that does happen through the Orphan Well Association, which is largely funded by industry, it's received about 30% of its historic budget from taxpayers, but it's in general funded by industry, and the entire industry pays a levy based on what share of the overall liabilities they're responsible for. So each company, whatever percent of the overall liabilities they have, contributes to the levy. The problem with the Orphan Well Association is it's never planned for the future. It operates on a current year basis. So it sets a budget for this year's operations, whatever this year's inventory of work it has, and it sets its budget and collects. It's often been $7 million a year, $10 million a year. In recent years, it's escalated up to 15, 30, and now 60 million. And they're currently operating on a large public loan from the government of 235 million. So they can accelerate a decade of work into these current 3 years, so they can do a lot more work. But even all that isn't enough money for them to clean up just their current inventory of orphan wells. And there's many more to come. And so the problem is this industry-funded organization has never planned for the future, has never saved any money, and is rustling a lot of feathers within industry to pay these increasing levies for work they're not personally responsible for to clean up. And there's always rumblings that if that annual bill gets too high, industry will just stop playing that game, and the Orphan Well Fund will dissolve and not be there to clean up what's left over. And so because We don't require them to clean up in any certain amount of time. These liabilities can be passed from company to company to company to company, and only at the very end of the game, when a handful of wells are left without an owner, the industry-funded Orphan Well Association takes over. But it's really a rounding error. Orphans are about 3,000 wells in Alberta, but the ultimate job of cleaning up is 300,000 wells, and that's what we actually need to be concerned about. But we struggle even to manage the actual orphans, and so that's a big part of the reason we've accumulated so much over the years.
Can I ask a question? How many orphan wells are being cleaned up now? Are there any?
Yeah, the Orphan Well Association has dramatically expanded its annual budget in recent years. Not long ago, they were doing $12 million worth of work a year, and they would plug dozens of wells every year and do reclamation work. With the big public loan, their annual budget has dramatically increased. They're operating on $80 million in activity. They're having trouble scaling up to spend all that money, but it's accelerated because the orphans have accelerated. A couple of years ago, there were dozens of orphans. Now there's 3,000, and Sequoia's left thousands more in limbo. It's unsure whether they're going to end up in the Orphan Well Association or elsewhere. But their workload has expanded and their budget has gone with it, but there's much, much more to come behind that.
You mentioned Sequoia, and you also mentioned the conflict that exists at the AER. That's a perfect example, isn't it? I mean, you've got the regulator, being pretty pliant in allowing a lot of these acquisitions to have taken place in the first place, and now they're the largest creditor in that case. Do you think that there should be some kind of a split up of responsibilities, maybe breaking up the AER so it's not in a conflict position?
Well, the Alberta Liability Disclosure Project we don't have any policy, we don't have any say in proposed solutions like that, but it is a big conflict, and Sequoia illustrates the need for more transparency. If the regulator had a better understanding of the actual corporate health of companies like Sequoia, they could have prevented this from happening. They were too eager to see these wells stay alive and to see this activity continue when there needed to be a lot more scrutiny about the ultimate health of these companies. And the regulator is doing a lot of work to better measure the corporate health, which is welcome. It's very late in the game to be finally doing that sort of crucial work, but if we're going to prevent more Sequoias in the future, there needs to be a lot more of that transparency about who it is operating these wells.
Any other questions?
I don't imagine that the bankrupt oil companies are paying for anything, are they?
Well, up until very recently, they hadn't been, but the Redwater Energy case at the Supreme Court reestablished the principles that were established in Alberta 28 years ago in 1991, that the regulators have the authority to force cleanup, even in bankruptcy, that the cleanup comes before even secured creditors. And so the regulator hadn't been enforcing that for 28 years. They'd let these wells be transferred to another company and transferred to another company. And if they did go bankrupt, they were allowing the lenders to liquidate everything of value for themselves, leaving nothing for the cleanup. And the Redwater Energy case reestablished that the regulators do have the power. They come before the banks. And before the banks get their money back, we can force the cleanup. And so that is how it's been operating for a long time. But after the Redwater Energy case, there's the potential for that to change. The regulator has to start taking the initiative to enforce that. They've had that power for almost 30 years and haven't used it. But the Supreme Court just reaffirmed they do, and it'll be up to the public to help ensure that they actually use that power to make sure the polluter pays instead of the public.
Is that the Alberta regulator, John? Okay, and so the Supreme Court of Canada?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's the regulator's responsibility to hold the industry accountable for its legal obligation to clean up. And because the regulator has never enforced cleanup on any meaningful timescale, the problem has festered and grown and leaves us in the situation we find ourselves today.
And why are you talking about this now? You were mentioning something about you have the politicians here at the moment.
Yeah, we've been working on this project for 6 months, and it is not part of the public debate. And it deserves to be on the election agenda. It deserves to be debated in public with the best information possible. So Albertans deserve to hear the potential new government propose viable solutions for the scale of this problem.
What's the problem with the way it's funded now, the orphan well fund by the companies? There's a fund. What's the issue with the fund being?
Well, the Orphan Well Association is funded by an annual levy that companies pay based on how many liabilities they have. The problem is that it's never looked forward. It's never put money in the bank for a future day. And in recent years, the number of orphans has escalated, and their funding has escalated. But it makes the industry disgruntled. Big companies are paying for little wells companies' failures, and the industry doesn't like having to pay for someone else's mess. And these levies have doubled and doubled and doubled again in recent years. And there's going to need to be a better solution than forcing companies to pay for wells they weren't directly responsible for.
So what is the solution? Are you allowed to say what that is? Do you have any thoughts on a possible solution?
Well, I'm here today as a part of the ALDP, and they're not proposing solutions. I'm part of my own organization, Reclaim Alberta, is part of the coalition, and I've spent the last 3 years researching and trying to come up with a viable solution to this conundrum. But the coalition itself only is limited to the first step, and that's understanding the problem better, calling for transparency, and trying to ensure that the new government is committed to that.
What kind of commitment is it going to take financially for the government to really make a difference?
If the government does it right, it shouldn't involve a financial commitment on the part of the government. The government has to commit to holding industry accountable. That's the social contract. Every license comes with a legal obligation to return that site to its original state. It's only our failure to hold them accountable. They've made plenty of profit off of these wells, but they never set aside the money for the cleanup. If we are unable to hold them to their responsibilities, it is going to fall to taxpayers. And so it doesn't have to be a taxpayer burden, but without major reform, it will be.
So in your platform, you have timelines in there. Is that how vital is that?
Oh, it's absolutely critical that we have timelines for reclaiming oil and gas wells. Other jurisdictions like North Dakota and Texas have long had timelines that require that oil and gas wells, for example, can only be suspended for 3 years, and then they have to either be producing again or reclaimed. And we've got wells from the 1940s and 50s that are still suspended, which is really just a way of avoiding cleaning them up. And it's critical that government provide leadership here, and no other party is doing that. We're the only party that filed an emergency debate motion in the fall session of the legislature to address the $260 billion plus that it could be costing us in the future to reclaim our energy infrastructure, and all the other parties colluded to kill our emergency debate motion, and the NDP and UCP called it not an urgent issue, quote unquote, I believe. So it's a real failure of leadership, and it's going to hurt our energy industry if responsible homegrown Canadian energy companies are left holding the bag along with taxpayers for reclaiming oil and gas infrastructure when foreign companies go bankrupt or close up shop and leave.
So is that, in other words, it's making it more expensive for the local companies?
It sure is. It's a real failure of leadership by this NDP government, of course, decades of conservative governments before them. And it is going to hurt our oil and gas industry. We've got some of the best, most responsible energy producing companies in the world headquartered here in Canada, and they're going to be hurt by this lack of leadership on the part of the provincial Alberta government and the AER.
Is this the party's kind of ignoring the public need in favor of facilitating energy companies?
Well, I think that they've got a short-term political calculus that they think benefits them, but in fact, it's not going to benefit them or the energy industry to be not addressing this, these massive liabilities going forward and making sure that everyone contributes to solving the problem.
And also, when they talk about some of the medical concerns from these orphan sites, do you think it could also be framed as a public health concern?
Oh, most definitely. Public health is the number one issue that the provincial government should be concerned about, and so there's a huge component there of public health issues that need to be addressed.
There's been my father seriously affected by it, his ability to work, and we can't develop our land. They never got compensated for inability to develop their land, which is supposed to be the case. The problem is that the AR or its predecessors make some of the, enforce some of the rules, but municipalities enforce other rules, like how far a building has to be. And so this has never been resolved. It came up in my parents' case, was improperly decided in 1980, and has never been resolved in urban Alberta since. So that we have all sorts of laws about how far back you must stay from other development from an oil and gas facility, and these laws are primarily enforceable by the operator. The spacing laws, the minimum site area to keep all gas on the site, those laws are enforceable by the well licensee or the tank licensee. Totally ignored in Alberta. Totally ignored. We have unsafe sites like this. I just got one shut down in the city of Red Deer only a few weeks ago. I have a site like this in a place called Armacy Field, urban Edmonton, on Anthony Henday Drive and the route of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It vents gas across the freeway regularly there in Edmonton. They're building a substation close by. Substation and leaky gas from tank batteries don't mix.
So why do you think these things are allowed to go on unchecked for so long?
I can't speculate on that. What I do know is that when we make applications to the correct board with the jurisdiction to solve the problem, they simply say it's another board. In Edmonton, the area I just spoke of is a perfect example. There's no less than 10 bodies involved. There could be as many as 14. I've been to all of them, each and every